Welcome to Season 3 of the Spotlight series, Don't Just Survive, Thrive. Season 1 was launched to help people through the pandemic by talking to a variety of experts about topics such as psychology, finance, and health. Season 2 focused on more work-related issues, including HR, marketing, and leadership. Now it is time for Season 3. Season 3 is centred on the IT industry, specifically tech startups. There are also career spotlights where I talk to senior IT people about the secrets to their impressive career journeys. My name is Nicholas Steele, founder of JJP Talent Solutions, an Australian IT recruitment company. For over 20 years, I've helped tech startups and innovative SMEs to attract, recruit, and retain technical talent. I hope you enjoy listening. I'm delighted to introduce Yaniv Bernstein. Yaniv has extensive experience as a software engineering manager working for Google twice, both in Switzerland and then Sydney, as well as Flair HR, and until recently was VP of Engineering and then Chief Operating Officer at Airtasker. Yaniv, thank you for joining me on Season 3, Episode 22 of the Spotlight series, Don't Just Survive, Thrive.
Well, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. It's great to speak to you. Well, Yaniv, tell me a bit more about your background and your personal story.
Sure. So I grew up mostly in Melbourne, some of my early years in Israel, and then moved to Australia. Grew up in Melbourne, always was interested in computers. I think my first computer was a ZX Spectrum secondhand, where you had to load your programs off an audio cassette tape. So I always enjoyed computers, and that led to studying computer science at university and also doing a PhD in computer science. And from there, I went to Google, as you mentioned, as a software engineer, and then later as a software engineering manager, working across different parts of the company, including search, YouTube, and Google Maps. And then, after about 10 years there, with a small gap in the middle, I decided to enter the world of startups and scale-ups. And most recently, as you said, I was at Airtasker first as the VP of Engineering, and then kind of transitioning into a Chief Operating Officer role, which I'd be happy to talk about, what that transition looked like. But I think it really comes from, I guess, a sense of all of the different aspects of a software company needing to work together, and that engineering sort of fits part of that wider system.
Excellent. Well, I'd love to hear more about Airtasker, but first of all, if we wind back the clock to 2006, so what's that, 15 years ago, when you first worked for Google, it was kind of at that scale-up stage then, I think. And then you worked for them again after, I think you had about 18 months gap between, and then Google had become a much more corporate organization. So what was it like back in 2006 at Google, and how did it then change over time?
Yeah, so when I joined, it was already quite a large company. It had several thousand employees, but I guess you'd call it a late stage scale up. Mm-hmm. And what was really interesting was to see those sort of last vestiges of the startup scale up way of doing things that were just sort of being cast off. I remember the founders, Larry and Sergey, would still try to come into different teams and do a review with them and see what was happening and give them advice, which obviously, at the point at which you have hundreds of teams, no longer really is scalable. So that kind of went away. An interesting thing is that Google, it didn't become more corporate in the traditional sense. I think it tried very hard to hold on to its sort of identity as a startup. But I think that's in a sense, it was an attempt to defy the laws of gravity, because, being a large corporate is a function of your size. And I think some of the things that did change over the years was a sort of an increasing distance between the senior leadership and the people working on the ground on the projects. And also, I think a challenge to the core sense of mission. I think Google still has a strong identity as a sort of a corporate identity, but back when I joined, Google's mission statement was, and I believe still is, to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And I think back at the time when I joined, Google was still mostly the search engine and a few other allied services. And I think that mission statement really rang true, and it was something we could sort of rally around. But, fast forward to today, and of course, it's this enormous conglomerate of, many different services. And I think, to sort of ask what exactly is it and what is the role that I play within this company can become a bit more difficult. So I'd say that aspect of the culture did sort of atrophy a bit.
Yeah. So kind of losing its way, or just losing the mission coming all the way down throughout the organization, would you say?
So not quite losing its way, but I guess my feeling is when you develop as a company, I find the analogy to, your personal growth on your life journey as a person to be quite apt, because, you start as a baby and you become an adult, whether you like it or not, right? And I think adults who still like to act like children are, seen to be immature and not willing to accept, both the strengths and the weaknesses of their position. And I think it's the same for a company. A company needs to mindfully grow into the stage that it's at. And so, a large corporation, an adult company needs to act like an adult, which doesn't mean that it needs to be an adult in the same way as every other large corporation came before. I don't think that means everyone needs to start wearing suits or, becoming very bland or whatever the stereotypes are of the large corporation. But I think it does need to understand that fundamentally being a big company means that different possibilities are open to you and also closed to you compared to when you were smaller. And I think Google has at times struggled to fully accept that and internalize that.
That's such a great analogy. So it's a bit like being a parent. It doesn't mean that you have to lose your sense of fun, but you do have responsibilities that you just got to live up to. You've got to grow with that. So that's a really, really great analogy. I like that. And so I think you worked at IBM for those 18 months in between, and then ventured more into the startup scale-up world. So what was the transition like there, would you say?
Was definitely a bit of a shock. I guess in a sense, having spent 10 years at Google, I was somewhat institutionalized, which is to say that I had only really seen one way of doing things. And, I think Google is, an unusual company. It had, some of the large company issues I just talked about, but on the other hand, it had this incredibly strong engineering culture, I think is rightly known for having a very high hiring standards. And so you get to work with a lot of people who are, really at the top of their game. Going from that sort of highly capable organization into a startup world where, in a sense, it was my job to make it perform in that way. I didn't know what the gaps would be initially. And so there was definitely a learning process where things that I had taken for granted simply weren't the case. And so I kind of had to figure out, okay, if I have an end goal, if I want to get to Z and currently we're at A, like what's the way from A to Z? And that was a really interesting, sometimes painful, but definitely an interesting learning experience.
Definitely challenging. So coming from quite a corporate, well, not corporate, but that institutionalized type environment where I guess you get a lot of things done for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So a good example being hiring, right? I mean, as a manager at Google, the way you hire is you see a list of people who've recently been made offers and you say, I want this one. And suddenly having to do that whole thing for myself, right? All the way from talking to agency recruiters through to the interview process, hiring decisions, salary negotiations. These were all things I hadn't had any experience of being at a big corporate.
Definitely. You've got something in common with my sister, actually. She was one of the recruiters for Google in London.
There you go.
Back in about 2010, I think, 2011. But anyway, sorry. Enough about my sister. What would you say are the highlights of your career so far, Yaniv?
So one that always sticks out to me, I mentioned that I worked at YouTube, and the part of YouTube I worked at was called Content ID. And this was actually a system for managing copyright on YouTube. And I don't know if you remember, in the early days of YouTube, there was a lot of pirated content. You know, a lot of people would just upload movies or TV shows. This was before Netflix, anything like that. And what happened was there were a lot of big media companies that were suing YouTube and, frankly, could have had a relatively strong case. And so in response to that, Google built this technology called Content ID that was designed to detect copyrighted material that was being uploaded before it went live on the site. And so I was involved in that project. And the thing about that is, firstly, it was technically fascinating because, you could have people who are like in a movie theater with a handheld camera taking a video of the movie and then uploading it. And then we needed to be able to detect that it was actually the same content as the clean version. And we had to do this at enormous scale. So it was really interesting technically, but also it's a little bit of an unsung hero in terms of the story of modern copyright, because what happened is that initially what would happen is the system would detect copyrighted material and it would just block it. But over time, we added features that meant that content holder could actually choose to leave it up and monetize it. So if I upload a copy of a TV show or even, a video from my wedding that has copyrighted music on it, and, if you haven't licensed it, technically you are violating that record company's copyright. But what we would do is I say, we'll run ads against that wedding video. And that way the content holder gets paid and you get to upload this copyrighted material without anything bad happening to you. And so it was a sort of real pragmatic fix that has allowed people, fans, really, people who enjoy the content to actually use it as get compensated for the content that they've brought to the world. So it was actually really pragmatic. It's made a lot of money for the content industry and for YouTube. And we actually won an Emmy. It's not well known that there are technical Emmy awards for like technical innovations in the TV industry. And so we actually won an Emmy for that. So, I still remember that as a highlight.
That's fantastic. So rather than a very draconian penalise people, they weren't rewarded as such, but it was a kind of win-win situation for everybody.
Exactly. And it was very pragmatic. I think nearly everyone would concede that the copyright system is broken, but not in a way that can be easily fixed. And so I think, coming up with clever workarounds like that has actually been really valuable.
Yeah, definitely. I didn't know that. So thank you for that insight. And also you mentioned as well about your time at Airtasker, going from VP of Engineering and then Chief Operating Officer. So tell me a little bit more about that and the highlights, the challenges, all that kind of thing.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, like I kind of alluded to when you were asking me about the transition from Google, I had a much broader remit at Airtasker, and it really was my job to up-level the effectiveness of the engineering organization there. And, if any of your listeners have worked with software development processes, you'll know that it can be, a time-consuming and expensive process, and there are a lot of different ways it can go wrong. And, I had the benefit of learning from Google, which really does have one of the strongest engineering cultures and processes of any company in the world. And it was my challenge to figure out how to apply that to the team at Airtasker. And what was interesting was how multifaceted that challenge was, because there were certainly technical aspects. How do we improve our architecture and how do we improve our processes around software development and deployment? But what actually was the most challenging and the most interesting for me was the cultural changes to, how do we actually view ourselves as engineers? What is our role within the company? How do we take ownership for results that we provide? How do we make sure we're hiring the right people? And a lot of things like that. So it was very multifaceted. And, over the course of a couple of years, we really did step up our engineering game as measured by, I guess, the amount of reliability and predictability of the work that we did and the quality of the work that we did. But what happened when we got to that point is I started to realize that engineering on its own can be as amazing as you like in terms of delivering software. But if it's delivering the wrong software or delivering it in the wrong order, then it's all for naught. And so I think I naturally started to take more and more interest in my allied functions, in product management, in marketing, in product design, in data, and started to think more and more about the necessity for them all to work together in quite a complex and nuanced way. So I think as I spent more and more of my time doing that, the transition to a chief operating officer role was actually more natural than you might think. It wasn't a very sudden transition. I was doing a lot of this work with my peer functions already, and we kind of made it official in a sense that my job as chief operating officer was to create this high performance, cross-functional organization spanning from engineering all the way through to customer supports and HR. And, I found that really rewarding.
So looking at the organization from a much more holistic perspective, that everybody's interlinked, it's not just engineering siloed into marketing, siloed into sales, etc., that they all should work together.
That's right. And silos are worse than they sound, right? Because they sound bad enough, but the real problem is that you get enormous inefficiencies, like multiplicative inefficiencies in the jumps from one silo to another. So, from engineering, the way I experienced it was by the time a concept or a business need had gone through product management and then gone through product design, the scope of it had been massively increased without an understanding of the underlying technical constraints. And at the same time, the engineers charged with building the software had lost the context of why it was an important thing to build in the first place. So you really need to create nearly a kind of an organism where all of these different functions work together really quite tightly.
Definitely, and understand the why. And you've mentioned about building high-performing teams, and you're really passionate about that. So how, over the last, is it 15 plus years, have you created teams where individuals can really grow, thrive, and deliver massive value in that whole organism, as you describe it?
Yeah, so I think that's really the common theme running through all of this. And it was what we were just talking about. It is about understanding the why. And you asked about delivering massive value. The first thing for any individual to understand is that it is their job to deliver massive value and how they can do that. And that might seem self-evident, but again, my primary experience has been working within a software engineering organization. And a lot of developers who you hire, they see it as their job to build beautiful software. But it's not, right? Building the software is a means to an end, and the end is generating value. Now, one of the companies I admire the most in terms of how they operate internally is Netflix. And one of the things that they talk about, they've published extensively about their sort of leadership philosophy, and they talk about leading with context and not control. And the idea there is that it is unreasonable to expect any individual to maximize the value that they deliver if they do not know the context in which they are operating. So it really speaks towards radical transparency. And not only does that give people the context they need in which to operate, it also motivates them to deliver that value because suddenly they understand their purpose, the purpose of their team, and how that links back to customers and to the business. So I think that's really at the core of it. I do have a story. Back when I was at Google, about halfway through my time there, they kind of re-engineered the job ladders right? So like any company of any size, you had different job levels, and then to get promoted, to get a pay rise, you needed to level up. And they rearranged it along 3 dimensions. Now, the first 2 are, I think, technical and leadership. I didn't have a problem with that. The third one was impact. So basically, you would be evaluated on your performance based on the impact you had in your work. And at first, as a software engineer, I was outraged because I thought, I said to myself, my job is to build software. Now, whether it has impact or not is out of my hands, right? That's a product manager's job or in the market. But it actually, over the next year or so, it was sort of my road to Damascus, where I realized, oh, okay, the way to interpret this is that it is no longer just my job to build software. I am responsible for having impact, which means even though my job title is software engineer, I need to care about the product. I need to care about the marketing. I need to care about the users. And yeah, I became a real pain in the butt because I would challenge all of my peers in those other functions. But ultimately, it was really rewarding and did lead to better impact for the teams. And so that's something, it's a value I try to instill in the people who I lead and the teams that I work with, is that real sense of ownership and focusing on value delivery and working backwards from that.
Definitely. Do you know a company called Schedulo? They're a Brisbane success story.
I'm certainly aware of them and their big success.
Yeah. So they're headquartered in San Francisco, and I know the senior engineering director there pretty well. And that's one of the things he said as well, is making an impact is so important to him and the rest of the team. So, what would you say when you're hiring, which it sounds like you've got a lot of experience doing over the years? What are the 3 main attributes you look for when you're recruiting high performers in your teams?
Well, I've certainly got 2. I'll see if I can get to a third. So I think the first is inquisitiveness. And it comes down to the things that we've been talking about already. I want somebody who asks why, who challenges, who feels like they need to understand and get to the bottom of something rather than just kind of blindly following instructions. And so I do look for people with that sort of intellectual liveliness and curiosity. I think that's something that, always serves people in good stead. And the other one, maybe a little unfashionable in a sense, is actually talent and ability. And I say that's unfashionable because, there's a lot of discussion around growth mindset these days, and that people can improve in all sorts of areas, which 100% agree with, right? But growth mindset is not saying that everyone is equally talented in every dimension. And I think that, especially in my space in technology, the level of difficulty of what most companies are trying to do, that the global competitiveness really means that you have to do pretty amazing things. And to do that, finding people who are incredibly talented and intelligent is actually really valuable. So, quite often that can be raw, it can be in terms of potential, but I certainly believe that hiring for talent and attitude, but not only attitude, is actually really important.
Yes, absolutely. And I was going to ask you the question about potential. So you can look at a raw product as well, products being a person, of course. Sorry, I like to think of being a people person, but being able to see that they're very smart, intelligent, but still quite raw, and develop them into high performers from there. Awesome. And I guess maybe your other attributes would be mindset as well.
Yeah. So,
Attitude.
yes, there is one very simple framework. I think it came from a guy called Joel Spolsky, who's sort of quite a big blogger in sort of the software development space. And he said he looks for people who are smart and get things done. So I guess I've covered smart. Gets things done is an interesting one because it is, in a sense, you could call it an attitude or a mindset or a set of habits, but it's definitely true that there are people who are not smart but get things done. So things they do aren't that good. There are also people who are smart but don't get things done. And I did spend a few years in the academic world, and you can see people like that there. And it's really that combination of things, of people who like to finish what they start, who have that drive, I think that is actually a good way to sort of frame hiring.
Yes. That's and finding that combination is hard work. It's difficult getting, as you say, both of them together. So in terms of the teams that you've grown over the years, how have you really ensured that your team members have stayed engaged and committed to the team and the organisation as a whole?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. The way I see it is it comes down to having that sense of purpose and understanding of why they are doing what they're doing. Mm-hmm. So it's actually the answer I can give here might be quite similar to your earlier question about creating teams where individuals can grow, thrive, and deliver massive value. Because I think if you create that situation where individuals can grow, thrive, and create massive value, then they will be engaged and committed because they can see that their various sort of needs along Maslow's hierarchy are being met. And so really creating that environment where people have the context and the empowerment, and then also the recognition for the value that they do provide, for the growth that they have actually had, is really important. But I see the industry now. There's a lot of talk of skills shortages across a variety of roles within the broader technology space, and people have a lot of job options, right? And again, working with engineers, but also folks in marketing, product management, and so on. I know that this is an at-will relationship in the sense that any of these people could walk away with a good quality job offer or more within a couple of days. And so that means every day you have to be earning the right to continue to employ them. Mm-hmm. And some employers don't like that. I actually really enjoy it. It keeps us honest and it makes sure that we do have them engaged and committed. And engaged and committed employees are the only sort of employees I really want to work with anyway. So it actually aligns the incentives really well.
Definitely. And I think, as you say, some employers do seem to forget that it is a two-way street, that the employees need to be happy and satisfied in what they're doing, and the leaders and the employers themselves. So, yeah, that's great. And going back to the why and creating the impact and all that aspect. So moving on from teams, but still keeping with the theme of people, you have a fortnightly publication called People Engineering. So what's your purpose behind that, Yaniv?
Yeah, so I actually changed the name to People Engineering not that long ago. The previous name of the publication was WTF is a COO. And I called it that because I realized that very few people actually understood what a COO was. It's a very mysterious role. And if you Google it, you find very little good quality information. So I started by writing about that. But then I think it quickly developed into a broader discussion of leadership and organizational design and organizational purpose from my point of view. And really relating back to some of the discussion that you and I have already had, I do think that my philosophy is informed by, firstly, my engineering background. And engineers, software engineers, but also any sort of engineer, in a sense, it is in our training and our craft to think in terms of systems. Building a piece of software is a system. And a system is something that has many parts that interact in complex ways. That can be one definition. And so as a software engineer, it's a common misconception that the job is to write code. Code is the tool, but the real skill in being a software engineer is in designing that system. And so I think that's a sort of a skill I took from there. And as I've sort of gone on in my career, I've spent more and more time as a leader working with people, and I find people fascinating. And what I realized at the point at which you're an organizational leader, which is, let's say the people who report to you are already managers, you're in charge of an organization of some reasonable size. What you have to realize is another way of thinking of an organization is it is a system that is made of people. And so in a sense, your job as an organizational leader is to design and maintain that system for high performance. And I always like to add in here, that can seem reductionist and cold, but that's not my intention at all.
Mm-hmm.
This is not about reducing each human to a cog in the machine that is interchangeable. It's rather to design a good organization is to understand that every person is different and that they're complex beings, but that ultimately what you want from an organization is something that is much more than the sum of its parts, that requires a lot of complex interaction between people, and that your job as a leader is to make sure that that overall organization is high performing. And so I think from that philosophy, it's like, okay, in a sense, we're engineering with people, and that's where the title of the newsletter came from. And that is really what I explore is all of these fascinating topics around, okay, we're trying to create a system that, in a sense, has a sort of predictable properties and outputs for the business, but you're making it out of people. And how do you address all the issues around that? And an example of a recent post that I did was about, I called it old guard versus new guard, right? Where a very common issue you see in a scaling company is you get a lot of new people being hired in. Let's say a round of funding has been raised, and they have a different worldview and philosophy than the people who've been there since the beginning. And you see this kind of clash of philosophies and clash of personalities. And the question is, how do you as a leader cope with that? But also, how do you, as a member of the old guard or the new guard, you might find yourself in either position, how do you handle yourself there? And these are the sorts of things that resonate with a lot of people. They're like, oh, I've come across that. But strangely enough, it's not something that you see discussed very often. So that's sort of the niche that I'm looking at in people engineering. It's particularly for leaders, but really for anybody who works as part of an organization, which one way or another is most of us.
Well, it's a great publication, and I've seen that myself as organizations go from Series A to Series B and then to Series C, and that new guard and old guard. And people are so fascinating. That's why I love recruiting, because you meet so many different and unique people with different needs and wants and motivations, and they're not just a list of skills, so to speak, and the unpredictability as well, which sometimes can be a bit frustrating.
Absolutely. And so anyway, as any creator of free content on the internet, I guess, what I find rewarding is growing my audience. So yeah, I'd love it if folks would check it out, subscribe, it's completely free. And if you have any feedback or would like to join the conversation, I always appreciate that.
Well, what I will do is I will add the link in the show notes so that people can access the People Engineering newsletter. I think that's the best way to search for it. Awesome. So, Yaniv, you've had a really successful career so far. What would you say are the secrets behind your success?
So I think it comes down to two aspects of my temperament. One of them is that I am very outcome and impact and value driven. Sometimes I say that, I'm naturally lazy. Some people like doing work for its own sake. I don't. I like doing work when I can see what the purpose of it is. And so that means I'm always interested in understanding why we're doing this and making sure that it's a good use of that effort. So that's one. And the other is, I guess you could say I'm outspoken, or I'm not very good at keeping my mouth shut. And so I feel nearly this visceral need, if I don't understand something, or if I feel like it doesn't make sense, that I speak up. And, perhaps I've been lucky, the types of organizations I've worked with and so on, because I think a lot of people bite their tongue for fear of being seen as, the squeaky wheel or a troublemaker. But I've only ever gained positive career moments from being willing in a very, good faith way to question and challenge, the current plan or the current orthodoxy. So, yeah, if you look at every kind of jump I've made in my career, I could pretty much pin it down to those two attributes.
So laziness and speaking out, but I'm being facetious, but
no, I do think it's applied laziness, and I think laziness, it's quite commonly said that good engineers tend to be lazy because they are looking for ways to do things more efficiently. If you like working, you don't care about efficiency. If you don't like working, you're always optimizing. And so I think there is a lot of value in using your laziness consciously and productively.
Absolutely. And I think I have those attributes a little bit as well. Yeah. Look for the simplest way of getting that end result rather than just being a busy idiot, so to speak. And I'm not one to hold back and not speak up, to be perfectly honest with you, Yaniv.
Life's too short, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, I think sometimes things will come out of my mouth which I should have stayed in my head. But anyway, so last question. If you could turn back time, would you do anything differently?
Lots of things.
Ooh.
Not all of which I can disclose on this show. No, I think that the biggest pattern that I see is whenever I regret something, it tends to be I regret that I didn't do it sooner. Right? It's a courage of your convictions. You could call it trusting your gut. You could call it, acting on incomplete evidence. But in general, time is this valuable thing, and taking too long to make any sort of decision comes at a really significant but invisible cost. And so there's so many times where I just wish that the ultimate decision that I made is something that I knew I could have made earlier if I just had a bit more courage. And I think over time that really compounds. If I'd been able to do that, I'd be in a better place. And my organizations, the teams that I've led, would have been in a better place, been able to move faster if I'd been more decisive, even if occasionally it was a wrong decision.
And as you've got older, do you find that you have more confidence in those decisions to make it happen more quickly?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. You start to learn your own limits as well. I think one very common pattern I see is, in leaders, is if they see a problem, especially a people problem, they spent inordinate amounts of effort trying to solve it. Now, sometimes, you have to understand your limits in terms of your ability to cause other people to change or to force other people to change who they are and basically move on more quickly. And I think that's a problem I see over and over again in leaders and managers. They're conscientious, they're caring, and they unwittingly overestimate their own abilities to change things. And so they overinvest time, they defer important decisions because they think if they just try a bit harder for a bit longer, they can fix it.
So act early, act quickly.
Act early, act quickly, and then don't look back. Like most things in life are a percentage game, right? You get a lot of decisions, you get a lot of tries at things. And what you want to do is be right most of the time. But also you want to be quick.
Yes, absolutely. I remember my late father-in-law before we moved to Australia, and he said to me, look, I don't want you to move to Australia. However, you only really regret the things that you didn't do rather than the things that you actually do. So very similar advice as you would give. Well, thank you very much for sharing your insights, Yaniv. It's such a delight speaking to you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share?
Look, I really enjoyed the conversation. Like I said, I like to have people reading and engaging on my newsletter. I'm also very active on LinkedIn. I'm happy to accept connections from people in the industry, even if I don't know them, as long as you promise not to try to sell me something straight away. So, I've actually found it a really great community. And, having moved on from my job recently, the amount of engagement and great conversations I've had with people has been wonderful. So I always enjoy that. But yeah, I mean, that's about all.
Fantastic. Yeah. Annoying when people connect with you and then start selling almost immediately. It's just calm down.
Yeah.
But thank you very much, Yaniv.
Thank you, Nicola. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
hope that you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review. If you're looking for career advice, your next career opportunity, or to grow your tech team, then please call me, Nicholas Steele, on 0499 773 546, or go to our website, jjptalent.com.au. The Don't Just Survive, Thrive podcast is part of the Spotlight series, which includes the YouTube channel Spotlight on Software Development. If you want more insights into the software industry, particularly tech startups, then subscribe to the Spotlight on Software Development YouTube channel. Thank you for listening. Until next time.